The fluorescent fixtures of cell block C hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the usual prison clamor. Tonight, however, an unsettling quiet had settled in. The typical shouts, the rhythmic clang of weights from the rec yard, even the distant blare of the PA system, all seemed muffled, swallowed by a strange, heavy stillness. Officer Miller's boots echoed a little too loudly on the polished concrete, and he felt the hairs on his arms prickle. He'd worked the night shift in C Block for years. This silence felt fundamentally wrong. It wasn't peace, but a held breath. He ran a hand over his neatly trimmed beard, his brow furrowed. Usually, he found comfort in the predictable rhythm of the lockup, yet tonight, all predictability had dissolved. Leaning against the cool metal of the guard station, he scanned the rows of cell doors. Most inmates were asleep, or at least feigning it. Shadows stretched long and distorted under the dim emergency lights, giving the block a cavernous, almost spectral ambiance. Then he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible tap. Tap, tap. Tap. Too soft for a pipe, too erratic for anything structural. It sounded deliberate. Miller pushed off the wall, his footsteps softer now, senses heightened. The sound grew a fraction louder as he neared cell 7, Sly Sam's cell. Sam wasn't a hardened criminal, more a petty con artist, skilled at talking his way into or out of trouble. He was in for a string of elaborate, though ultimately harmless, confidence tricks. Yet, for the past week, Sam had been different. Usually a chatterbox, always trying to charm the guards with a joke or a sob story. He'd lately been withdrawn, eyes darting, a nervous energy thrumming beneath his smooth exterior. Miller had noticed, filed it away, but hadn't acted. Now, with the tapping, an unsettling pattern clicked into place. Miller stopped a few feet from cell 7, feigning interest in the communal shower schedule tacked to the opposite wall. The tapping continued. A short, sharp burst, then a pause, then another, softer series. It sounded like a fingernail, or perhaps a small stone against metal. Too intricate for a simple nervous habit. It was a code. He glanced quickly at nearby cells. Cell 6, empty. Cell 8, occupied by Silent. Steve, a man true to his moniker, a loner, rarely speaking, certainly not known for intricate communication. Miller peered through the small, reinforced window of Sam's cell door. The bunk was empty. Sam sat on the floor, back to the door, head bowed, rocking slightly, almost imperceptibly. Miller watched for a long minute. Sam's posture was unnatural, too rigid, too still. His hands were out of sight, tucked beneath him. The tapping ceased. A new sound emerged, a faint scratching, like something dragged across a rough surface. A knot tightened in Miller's stomach. He wasn't prone to overreacting, but his instincts screamed. This wasn't just Sam being Sam. This was calculated, clandestine. He cleared his throat, a deliberate, loud sound. "Everything all right in there, Sam?" he called out, his voice cutting the unnatural quiet. Sam jumped, a visible startle. He spun around, eyes wide and a little wild. "Officer Miller, just meditating, sir. Trying to find my inner peace, you know." He offered a shaky, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze flickered towards the bottom of his cell door, then back to Miller. Miller's eyes followed. Nothing. Just the gap between door and floor. "Inner peace, huh? That's a new one for you, Sam. Sounded like you were practicing the drums." Sam chuckled, a forced, hollow sound. "Just tapping my foot, sir. Nervous habit, always had it." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. He was sweating, despite the cool temperature. "Right," Miller drawled, holding Sam's gaze, trying to read him. Sam was a good liar, but tonight the cracks showed. Desperate anxiety replaced his usual charm. Well, try to keep the noise down. Some of us are trying to maintain the peace, not break it. Sam nodded vigorously. Absolutely, officer. My apologies. Won't happen again. He stood slowly, moving to his bunk. He sat down, facing away from the door again, but this time looked less natural, more posed. Miller lingered, letting the silence hang heavy. He turned slowly and began to walk away, his steps deliberately loud. He didn't go far, though. He stopped at the junction of two cell rows, out of Sam's direct line of sight through the door window, but with a clear view of cell 7. He pretended to adjust his radio, then subtly positioned himself to watch. Several tense minutes passed. The block remained eerily silent. Miller's heart thudded a steady rhythm against his ribs. He trusted his gut. Sam was up to something. Just as he was beginning to doubt himself, a tiny sliver of white appeared at the bottom of Sam's cell door. It was a folded piece of paper, no bigger than a matchstick, pushed slowly and carefully from beneath the door. It slid about an inch out, then stopped. Miller froze, breath catching. He watched, utterly mesmerized. The paper sat there, stark white against the gray concrete, undeniable illicit communication. It was proof. Proof that Sam wasn't just meditating, wasn't just nervous. He was involved in something that required coded tapping and clandestine notes. The thought that such a small, fragile thing could be passed right under his nose, under the very strictures of the prison, sent a chill down his spine, unrelated to the cool night air. Implications unfurled in his mind, chilling him to the core. This wasn't a petty con man playing games. This was bigger, requiring immediate attention. He took a slow, deep breath, his hand instinctively going to the small, cold comfort of his sidearm. The silence of cell block C no longer felt like a held breath. It felt like a trap. Warden Grimm's decision. The stale air in Warden Grimm's office, thick with the scent of old coffee and a faint metallic tang from the iron bars visible through the reinforced window, did little to settle Officer Miller's nerves. He stood rigidly before the imposing oak desk, a crumpled note clutched in his hand. Warden Grimm, a man whose very name seemed to be etched into the stone walls of Blackwood Penitentiary, looked up from a stack of paperwork, his gaze a weary but sharp probe. Lines of fatigue fanned out from his eyes, but the intensity in them was undiminished. "Something on your mind, Miller?" Grimm's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse, sir," Miller began, his voice a little hoarse. "I think Sam, Sly Sam, is up to something." He laid the folded note, its coded symbols and indecipherable language, to the untrained eye, onto the polished surface of the desk. Grimm picked it up, his thick fingers tracing the odd glyphs. A humorless chuckle escaped him. "Sam, the man hasn't had an original thought in 20 years, let alone a grand scheme. He's a petty thief, Miller, not a criminal mastermind. Probably just doodling." "He's been quiet, sir." "Too quiet," Miller insisted, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. "And when I questioned him, he was jumpy. Said he was meditating." "Sam? Meditating?" Miller practically scoffed. "Then I saw him slide this out from under his door, quick as a viper. It's a code, Warden. I'm sure of it." Grimm leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond Miller's shoulder. "Sam's always been a fidgety one. Perhaps he's just feeling the walls closing in, more than usual." There was a dismissive wave of his hand, but Miller noticed the slight tightening around the warden's mouth, subtle shift that indicated he wasn't entirely convinced by his own words. "Sir, with all due respect, I've been guarding these cells for 10 years. I know Sam. This isn't him. And that code, it looks too deliberate to be a doodle." Miller felt a prickle of frustration. He wasn't one to make waves, but this felt different, more serious than the usual inmate shenanigans. The silence in cell block C had been unsettling, a predatory hush that had set his teeth on edge. Grimm picked up the note again, turning it over in his hand. He chewed on his lower lip, a habit Miller knew indicated deep thought, not dismissal. The faint glow of the desk lamp glinted off the silver threads in the warden's neatly combed hair. Finally, he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire prison. "All right, Miller," Grimm said, his voice now devoid of its earlier skepticism, replaced by a steely resolve. "You've got a good gut, and it rarely steers us wrong. We can't afford to be complacent, not with the new intake we're expecting, and certainly not with the whispers I've been hearing about things heating up outside these walls." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "We'll keep an eye on him. A very close eye." Miller felt a surge of relief. "How, sir?" "Covertly," Grimm said, pushing himself up from the desk. He walked to the window, staring out at the gray concrete yard where the last vestiges of afternoon light were fading. "We'll install a camera. Cell 7, you said?" "That's the one, sir." "Right. Find Peters and Davies. Tell them to meet me in my office in 15 minutes, and tell them to bring their quiet shoes." Grimm turned, a glint in his eye. "This stays between us, Miller. Understand? No one, not a single soul, knows about this. Not until we know what we're looking at." Later that evening, under the cloak of deep twilight, two figures moved like shadows through the deserted corridors of cell block C. Peters, a burly guard with surprisingly nimble fingers, carried a small, nondescript black box, while Davies, leaner and equally cautious, held a specialized toolkit. The air was heavy, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of settling metal. They reached cell 7, the door an imposing slab of steel. Peters expertly disabled the lock's alarm system, a soft click, barely audible. Davies, meanwhile, was already removing the small, almost unnoticeable grate of the overhead light fixture, his movements precise and practiced. They worked in tandem, a silent ballet of clandestine installation. The tiny lens, no larger than a pea, was nestled perfectly into a modified bolt, its angle carefully adjusted to capture the entire cell's interior without attracting attention. A thin, fiber optic cable, practically invisible, snaked its way through the ventilation shaft, connecting to a discrete recording device hidden deep within the prison's unused maintenance tunnels. Within minutes, the grate was replaced, the alarm re-engaged, and the two guards were melting back into the shadows, leaving no trace of their intrusion. Officer Miller, watching from a discreet distance at the end of the corridor, felt a knot of tension in his stomach. He hadn't been wrong about Sam. Now, the waiting began, and with it, the unsettling anticipation of what secrets the tiny lens might reveal. The silence of cell block C, once merely unusual, now felt pregnant with unspoken threats, a hushed prelude to something far larger and more dangerous than any of them could yet imagine. The secret watch. The repurposed storage room hummed with a forgotten scent of dust and old cleanser. Peters and Davies, less conversant with the intricacies of surveillance tech, clumsily wrestled with wires, their breath misting in the cool basement air. Miller, by contrast, moved with an engineer's innate grace, honed by years spent coaxing life from obsolete radios and cantankerous security systems. He secured the final cable to the monitor. A low thrum vibrated in the stillness. Then he engaged the power. The screen sputtered to life, revealing a grainy monochrome tableau of Sam's cell. "All right," Miller sighed, kneading his temples. "Let's hope this isn't a wild goose chase." His voice, a nervous undertone beneath a veneer of confidence, was barely a whisper. He pulled a scarred office chair close, settling in, his gaze shackled to the display. Peters, typically the purveyor of levity, shifted uneasily. "You really think he's cooking something up, Miller? Sam seems, well, harmless, always humming that dreadful tune." Davies, ever the grounded realist, leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "Harmless men don't typically receive coded messages, Peters. Miller has an uncommon nose for trouble." He cast a respectful glance at Miller. The initial hours unfolded as a monotonous reel of Sam's mundane prison existence. He paced his cell, a slow, measured shuffle that had worn a ghost path into the concrete. He ate his meal, each morsel consumed with almost ritualistic precision. He stretched, a series of deliberate, controlled movements that hinted at rigorous self-discipline. Miller observed, every muscle coiled, his eyes unblinking. He'd witnessed countless men feign passivity, but Sam's stillness felt distinct, the quietude of a predator biding its time, not a man surrendering. "See?" Peters whispered an hour into their vigil. "Just Sam being Sam. Maybe he simply enjoys enigmas." Miller remained mute, his attention wholly consumed by the miniature screen. He noted how Sam's eyes, despite the low resolution, constantly scoured the cramped space, as if seeking something only he could perceive. A subtle tension stiffened Sam's shoulders, a faint clench in his jaw, betraying an inner turbulence not otherwise evident. As the afternoon waned, the air in the surveillance room grew heavy with unspoken expectation. The equipment's gentle hum settled into a rhythmic drone, a counterpoint to the languid tick of a cheap wall clock. Miller felt a familiar tremor of anxiety begin to unfurl in his chest. This was often the prelude, arid stretches of inactivity, followed by a sudden, jolting revelation. He'd witnessed it before, the hushed calm before the tempest, the stillness that preceded pandemonium. Davies, growing restive, began a soft drumbeat on the doorframe. "Any chance he knows we're watching?" Miller shook his head slowly. "The camera's minuscule, too cleverly concealed, and even Sam can't pierce concrete." Yet his tone lacked conviction. Sam possessed an uncanny perception, an almost animalistic intuition that frequently defied logic. The hours bled into evening. The light filtering through the storage room's small, grimy window faded, deepening the prison's twilight embrace. Miller's eyes began to sting from their relentless focus. He blinked, rubbing them fiercely, then locked his gaze back onto the screen. Sam was now seated on his cot, staring intently at the wall. No pacing, no stretching, just staring. This departure from his routine sent a jolt of renewed alertness through Miller. "He's stopped moving," Miller murmured, leaning closer to the monitor. "This is new." Peters and Davies edged nearer, their earlier nonchalance supplanted by a shared tension. The room's quiet deepened, punctuated only by the hard drive's whir and the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of Sam's breathing, captured by the microphone. Sam raised a hand slowly, bringing his index finger to his lips. He held it there a moment, then traced a small, almost invisible symbol on his other palm. It was swift, subtle, easily missed by an inattentive eye. A chill snaked down Miller's spine. This was no idle gesture. It was a communication. He rewound the footage, replaying the fraction of a second multiple times. With each iteration, the motion gained clarity, profundity. "He's signaling," Miller whispered, a grim satisfaction lacing his voice. "He's definitely signaling." The scattered fragments were coalescing, not yet a perfect mosaic, but undeniably interlocking. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the conviction that his instincts had been razor-sharp all along. The preceding quiet had been a masterful deception. The true game had just begun. Sly Sam's first move. The digital clock on Miller's screen flickered, displaying 6 a.m. A new day, and the same old Sam. The cell was still bathed in the low, yellow glow of the standard issue bulb, and Sam lay motionless on his cot, a human-shaped lump under a thin, gray blanket. Miller had taken the first watch, largely because he trusted his own eyes more than anyone else's when it came to Sam. Peters and Davies had grumbled, but Miller's insistence had won out. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying the subtle palm tracing from the night before. A silent movie on the inside of his eyelids. Miller sipped lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste a welcome jolt. The hours crawled by with the tedious predictability of prison life. At 6:30, the loud clang of a distant door announced breakfast. Sam stirred, a slow, deliberate unfolding of limbs. He sat up, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so ordinary it was almost suspicious in itself. Miller leaned closer to the monitor, his gaze sharp, dissecting every micro-expression, every twitch. Sam swung his legs off the cot and stretched, a long, languid movement that showcased the lean strength beneath his faded uniform. He scratched his chest, then ran a hand through his perpetually messy hair. The breakfast tray, a metal rectangle with 3 distinct indentations for unappetizing food, slid through the slot in his door. Sam approached it without eagerness, picked up a plastic spoon, and began to eat the lumpy oatmeal with a methodical, almost ritualistic slowness. He ate every bite, then meticulously wiped the tray clean with a corner of his sleeve, before pushing it back through the slot. The rest of the morning followed a similar pattern of mundane activities. Sam performed his mandatory 20 push-ups, then 20 sit-ups, his movements precise and controlled. He spent an hour pacing the confines of his cell, a restless lion in a cage too small. He picked up the single book allowed to him, a worn copy of some philosophical treatise, and stared at its pages for a long time, though Miller couldn't tell if he was actually reading. There was no fidgeting, no nervous energy, nothing to suggest a man planning anything beyond enduring another day. It was almost frustrating in its ordinariness. "He's just a normal guy, Miller," Peters had said last night, yawning. "You're seeing ghosts." Miller hadn't argued. He just watched. Lunch came and went, another quiet, solitary meal. The afternoon brought more pacing, a few minutes of contemplation by the narrow window, looking out onto a brick wall, and then, finally, the unexpected. Sam stretched again, this time with a more pronounced arch of his back. He moved towards his cot, not to lie down, but to crouch beside it. Miller's breath hitched. Sam reached under the thin mattress, his fingers probing the underside of the bed frame. For a fleeting second, Miller wondered if he was imagining it, if the camera angle was playing tricks. Then Sam's hand emerged, and in his palm, glinting under the cell light, was a small, perfectly polished piece of metal. It looked like a shard from a broken mirror, or perhaps a carefully smoothed piece of aluminum foil, but its surface caught the light with an unnatural brilliance. Miller zoomed in, the grainy image sharpening around Sam's hand. The object was no bigger than his thumb, expertly hidden and now openly displayed. Sam looked at it for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes flickered towards the cell door, then to the upper corner, where the camera was discreetly mounted. Did he see it? Did he know? Miller held his breath, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Sam's gaze lingered on the camera for a heartbeat too long, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift that sent shivers down Miller's spine. Then he turned his back to the camera, shielding the object with his body. Miller cursed under his breath, adjusting the angle. But Sam was too clever, too precise. He moved just enough to block a clear view of what he was doing with the object. Miller could only see the rhythmic movement of Sam's arm, bent at the elbow. A faint, metallic tap echoed through the surveillance speakers, followed by another and another. Tap, 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 tap. It was barely audible, a faint, rhythmic sound against the thick concrete walls, almost lost in the background hum of the prison. Miller's mind raced, trying to decipher the cadence, the meaning. Was it Morse code? A prearranged signal? He strained his ears, trying to discern a pattern, but the sound was too subtle, too broken by the cell's acoustics. Sam continued his tapping for several minutes, a silent symphony of clandestine communication. His face, when he finally turned back towards the camera, was utterly blank, revealing nothing of the secret he'd just enacted. He slipped the shiny object back under his mattress with practiced ease, then resumed his pacing as if nothing at all had happened. Miller leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. Sam wasn't just observing, he was actively communicating right under their noses. The game, as Miller had suspected, had truly begun, and Sam, Sly Sam, had just made his first move. The implications were chilling, whispers and codes. The grainy monitor flickered, displaying the familiar, sterile confines of Sam's cell. Miller, hunched over the console in the dimly lit security room, watched, a knot tightening in his stomach. He'd replayed the previous night's footage countless times, the metallic glint of the shard, the precise, deliberate taps, an undeniable pattern that had resonated with his own gut feeling. Now, with the new covert camera providing an unobstructed view, he leaned closer, his breath held. Hours blurred into a mundane cycle of pacing and staring at walls, a rhythm broken only by the clang of meal trays. Then, a subtle shift. Sam, usually a creature of habit, paused mid-stride. His head cocked almost imperceptibly, his gaze fixed on the shared wall with Will's cell. Miller's pulse quickened. He zoomed in, the pixelated image amplifying the tension in Sam's posture. A faint, almost imperceptible tap. Tap, tap, tap echoed through the sound feed, a ghost of a sound that only Miller's amplified senses could detect. Sam's eyes, usually hooded and unreadable, held a spark of recognition. He moved, not with urgency, but with a calculated slowness, toward his bunk. Reaching beneath the mattress, his fingers brushed against the same spot, retrieving the small, polished shard. This time, there was no hesitation. He pressed the metal to the wall, a series of quick, rhythmic taps breaking the silence. Tap, 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 tap. Miller felt a surge of validation, a grim satisfaction. Peters had dismissed it, but Miller's instincts had been right. This wasn't some random fidgeting. It was a conversation, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. The sheer audacity of it, under their very noses. Later that evening, after the last patrol had passed and the hum of the facility settled into its nightly drone, Sam became a whirlwind of clandestine activity. He moved with a new purpose. a controlled energy that belied his usual lethargy. From a hidden compartment beneath a loose floor tile, he retrieved a small, stubby pencil and a half bar of soap, its surface strangely smooth and unblemished. Miller watched, fascinated, as Sam began to draw on the soap with meticulous precision. Lines emerged, crisscrossing and intersecting, forming what looked unmistakably like a crude map. Circles indicated key locations, faint X's marked points of interest. Then, Sam began to scratch a series of symbols alongside the map. Strange squiggles, geometric shapes, and what appeared to be alphanumeric sequences. He would pause, occasionally glancing at the door, his movements fluid and economical, a man accustomed to working under duress. The implications were staggering. A map. Codes. This wasn't merely a message, it was a plan, unfolding right before Miller's eyes. He felt a chill, despite the warmth of the security room. This went far beyond petty contraband, or a simple escape attempt. The level of detail, the hidden tools, the sophisticated communication system, it all pointed to something far more organized, more dangerous. Sam worked for what felt like an eternity, his brow furrowed in concentration. Once satisfied, he carefully smoothed the surface of the soap with his thumb, erasing the markings. He then placed the soap bar back into its dish, appearing as innocuous as any other inmate's toiletries. But Miller knew. The information had been transferred, memorized, ready for the next stage. The next morning, Miller found himself in Captain Davies' office, the replayed footage of Sam's covert cartography projected onto a large screen. Davies, a man usually unflappable, stared at the image with a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. Peters, standing beside him, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier dismissals echoing in the suddenly tense silence. "He's drawing maps, Captain," Miller explained, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And codes. He's carving them into the soap, memorizing them, then wiping them clean." Peters scoffed. "A nervous habit." "Soap? Really, Miller? It's probably just doodling. Inmates get bored." Davies silenced him with a sharp glance. "Doodling doesn't involve a hidden pencil and a clandestine tapping system, Peters. And it certainly doesn't involve him meticulously erasing his doodles after he's done." He gestured to the screen, where Miller had paused the footage at a particularly clear shot of Sam's intense concentration. "Look at the detail, the precision. This isn't random. This is calculated." Miller felt a surge of vindication. He's communicating with Will, Captain. And what they're communicating about, it's a plan, an elaborate one. Davies leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the screen, a grim realization dawning in his eyes. "A plan for what, Miller? An escape? Or something far worse?" The air in the room crackled with a newfound urgency. The prison, once a fortress of steel and stone, now felt like a sieve, and Miller, the quiet observer, had just revealed a crack in its foundations. The whispers and codes were no longer mere inmate antics. They were the prelude to a storm. The outside connection, the familiar clang of the lock echoing in the antiseptic corridor, usually left Miller unfazed. Today, however, it struck a discordant note, stirring a fresh current of unease. He shouldered open the heavy steel door to Sly Sam's cell, the air thick with the faint metallic scent of disinfectant. And something else, a subtle, almost imperceptible undertone of coiled ambition. Sam lay sprawled on his cot, a tableau of calculated indifference. Yet Miller caught the minute tremor in his hand as he toyed with a loose thread on his worn blanket. Last night's surveillance had solidified Miller's intuition, transforming vague apprehension into a laser-sharp certainty. "Routine inspection, Sam." Miller's voice remained level. belying the prickle of adrenaline beneath his skin. He moved with deliberate care, his gaze systematically sweeping every surface, every shadow. The cell offered little to scrutinize. A cot, a small metal table bolted to the floor, a single shelf holding a well-thumbed Bible, and a few permitted paperbacks. Miller's hand traced the underside of the table, searching for any anomaly, then shifted to the shelf, meticulously examining each book's spine. Sam watched him, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. Miller's attention drifted to the unassuming stainless steel toilet and sink unit in the corner. He'd inspected this fixture countless times, but the previous night's discovery, the intricate map, the coded messages, lent it a sudden, heightened significance. He knelt, the cold concrete chilling his uniform trousers, and peered into the toilet bowl. Nothing immediately apparent, just the usual faint water lines. He gave the flush handle a perfunctory wiggle, then ran his fingers along the porcelain rim, smooth and unbroken. His fingertips dipped into the water, tracing the inner curve. A sudden, hard thump against his ribs. There, tucked against the curved drain, almost camouflaged beneath the waterline, lay a small, dark, irregular shard of plastic. It was nearly black, blending seamlessly with the shadows in the bowl. Miller's breath hitched. He carefully nudged it with his fingertip. It didn't float freely like a stray bit of debris, but seemed deliberately wedged. He straightened, maintaining a neutral expression, and glanced at Sam. The inmate, though still on his bunk, now held a strained posture, his eyes following Miller's every move with unnerving intensity. Miller knew better than to reveal his find immediately. He needed to secure it, examine it, confirm the dread coiling in his gut. "Plumbing check, Sam," Miller managed, his voice a little rougher than intended. He pulled heavy-duty rubber gloves from his belt. Plunging his hand into the cold water, his fingers closed around the object. It was no bigger than his thumb, surprisingly solid, not brittle. As he pulled it free, a minute, hair-thin antenna, almost invisible, uncurled slightly from one end. He held it up, dripping water onto the pristine concrete floor. It was unmistakably a fragment of a miniature radio receiver, expertly disguised and meticulously concealed. The implication struck him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a crude bug or a covert signaling device. This was a direct, two-way communication link. This wasn't just Sam and a single accomplice. This was a network. Sam shot upright on his bunk, eyes wide, his carefully constructed indifference shattering. A flicker of genuine alarm crossed his face, instantly replaced by a mask of cold fury. Miller secured the radio piece in an evidence bag, his mind racing. The map on the soap, the coded messages, the intricate timing, it all coalesced with horrifying clarity. This wasn't merely an escape attempt. This was something far grander, a coordinated operation reaching beyond the prison walls. The sophistication of the device, its masterful concealment, spoke volumes about the resources and meticulous planning involved. He left Sam's cell, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily. Walking down the corridor, the prison's usual symphony, distant shouts, the metallic clang, the drone of the ventilation system, seemed to take on a sinister hum. He immediately sought out Captain Evans. Evans, a gruff man with a perpetually furrowed brow, listened intently as Miller laid out his findings, placing the evidence bag on his desk. His initial skepticism, usually a formidable barrier, crumbled with each word Miller spoke. The tiny radio piece, nestled in its clear bag, gleamed under the harsh office lights, a silent testament to the unfolding threat. "A radio receiver?" Evans breathed, picking up the bag, his fingers tracing the outline of the minuscule object. Hidden in his toilet. Miller, this runs deeper than anything we've encountered. This isn't a local job. This is an outside connection. His voice was low, imbued with a new urgency. Word spread quickly among the senior guards. The initial amusement and disbelief that had greeted Miller's early suspicions evaporated, replaced by a grim realization. Sergeant Jenkins, usually jovial, looked pale. So he's not just talking to someone in here, Jenkins murmured, staring at the evidence. He's coordinating with people outside. What kind of operation are we looking at here? Miller felt a chill creep up his spine. The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, yet brimming with ominous possibilities. The prison, once an unbreachable fortress, now felt like a vulnerable point in a much larger, more dangerous game. They were no longer merely guarding inmates. They were guarding against a shadow, an unseen enemy that stretched far beyond their concrete walls. The scope of Sam's plot had just expanded exponentially, and with it, the stakes for everyone involved. Federal intervention. The clatter of the phone receiver against its cradle echoed in the sudden silence of Warden Grimm's office. His face, usually a mask of controlled severity, was etched with a new kind of grimness, a chilling premonition that something far larger than a simple prison breach was unfolding. He looked at Miller, who stood rigidly by the door, the radio receiver still resting on the polished surface of the warden's desk, like a malevolent, miniature artifact. "Federal authorities are on their way," Warden Grimm announced, his voice devoid of its usual booming authority, replaced with a strained undertone. "Agent Jones, she's the best. Handles cases like this all the time." He didn't sound entirely convinced, as if even the best might be outmatched by the sheer audacity of Sam's operation. Miller shifted his weight, the adrenaline still thrumming beneath his skin. He'd meticulously resecured Sam's cell, the radio receiver now cataloged and bagged, but the image of Sam's unblinking stare, devoid of panic, was seared into his memory. It wasn't the look of a man caught, but of one whose plan had merely hit a snag. Less than 2 hours later, the outer gate rattled with an unfamiliar urgency. A sleek black SUV, utterly out of place against the prison's drab concrete facade, glided to a halt. From it emerged Agent Jones, a woman who seemed to carry the weight of federal authority in her very posture. Her tailored suit, crisp and unwrinkled despite the long drive, seemed to absorb the muted light of the prison corridor. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over the waiting group. Warden Grimm, Miller, and a handful of other senior officers, with an almost surgical precision. Behind her, 2 equally formidable agents, their faces impassive, began unloading equipment cases from the vehicle. Warden Grimm. Agent Jones's voice was calm, yet it possessed an undeniable edge of command. "Officer Miller, I presume?" Her gaze settled on Miller, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Let's not waste any time. I want to see everything." The warden led the procession to the secure briefing room. The air crackled with a new tension, a sense of gravitas that hadn't been present even after Miller's initial discovery. Agent Jones, without preamble, took the head of the conference table, her team swiftly setting up laptops and specialized imaging equipment. She examined the bagged radio receiver, turning it over in her gloved hands, her brow furrowing slightly as she noted its intricate construction. "This is professional," she murmured, more to herself than to the room. "Not your average contraband job." Miller, at the warden's prompting, began to recount his meticulous investigation from the very beginning. The unusual delivery, the subtle shift in Sam's routine, the almost imperceptible changes in the cell, The discovery of the map and the coded messages hidden in plain sight. He spoke with a quiet intensity, his observations detailed and precise, revealing a mind that saw beyond the surface. Agent Jones listened, her gaze never leaving Miller's face, occasionally interjecting with a terse, pointed question. Her team began uploading the extensive surveillance footage from Sam's cell block, the digital timestamps flashing across the screen. They zoomed in on specific moments Miller had highlighted. Sam's seemingly innocuous stretches, the precise angle of his hand as he adjusted the toilet lid, the fleeting glance he cast at the ventilation grate. "He's good," Agent Jones conceded, a grudging respect in her tone as she watched Sam's subtle movements. "Very good. Almost too good for a standard inmate." As the footage played, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The seemingly random taps, the slight pauses in Sam's conversations with other inmates, the way he meticulously cleaned his cell, all of it, under Agent Jones's expert eye, coalesced into a sophisticated network of communication. Her team's advanced software began to highlight subtle anomalies, almost imperceptible flickers in the digital feed, suggesting moments where Sam might have been receiving or transmitting data. Then came the moment of the discovery. The camera, positioned at a high angle, captured Miller's initial inspection, his methodical approach, and the sudden, almost imperceptible stiffening of his posture as he knelt by the toilet. The subsequent footage, now slowed and enhanced, clearly showed the gleam of the miniature antenna as Miller carefully extracted the device. Agent Jones leaned back, a pensive expression on her face. "A receiver of this caliber, hidden with such precision. This isn't about an escape warden. This is about coordination. He's running something from in here, orchestrating it with outside elements." She tapped a pen against the table. "And that map, those coded messages, they tie into it. He's not just a pawn. He's a vital node in a much larger operation." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the weight of the revelation. Miller felt a strange mix of vindication and dread. His instincts, once dismissed as overzealous, had been terrifyingly accurate. The prison, once a fortress, was now a critical vulnerability, a hub in a shadowy network far more expansive and dangerous than anyone had dared to imagine. Agent Jones's presence, while reassuring in its authority, only underscored the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a prison problem anymore. It was a federal one. And Sly Sam, the inmate who had seemed so ordinary, was at the heart of it all. The signal and the stir. The dispassionate drone of the solitary wing's fluorescent lights usually lent an air of sterile calm, but to Sly Sam, their rhythmic flicker counted down to zero. A lifetime architect of subtlety, he wouldn't fail, not even with federal eyes undoubtedly fixed upon him. His gaze, habitually a mask of indifference, now held a fresh glint of anticipation. He ran a hand over his meticulously ordered bunk, an innocuous gesture that was, in fact, a precisely timed sequence. Fingers brushing rough canvas, tracing a specific seam, then a near imperceptible pressure on a loose thread. Each movement was a deliberate, silent semaphore. Next door, a man known only as the Mute sat cross-legged, seemingly lost in meditation, but his downcast eyes twitched. His hearing, sharpened by years of confinement, registered the nearly inaudible scratch of Sam's thumbnail against the bunk's frame. A distinct pattern, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. The Mute's breath hitched, a tremor vanishing as quickly as it came. Slowly, he reached under his pillow, not for a book, but for a length of braided wire he'd been shaping into a crude shiv. His calloused fingers tested the sharpened tip. For him, This wasn't about escape. It was about the freedom of the act, the momentary liberation of chaos. Down the corridor, in cell block C, whisper. Johnson, whose voice rarely rose above a murmur, began to hum. It was a low, tuneless drone, but the specific melody was a prearranged signal. His cellmate, Boulder, a hulking figure usually sunk in sluggish stupor, suddenly shifted. Boulder's eyes, typically dull, sharpened, fixing on the door with an intensity that promised imminent eruption. He began to stretch, a slow, deliberate series of movements that cracked his knuckles and strained his thick neck. Not a morning routine, but a man preparing for a fight. He knew the hum. It meant go time. In the makeshift command center, Officer Miller watched the live feeds from the newly installed cameras, a knot tightening in his stomach. The air, usually sterile and calm, now thrummed with a nervous energy that mirrored the rapid blinking of the server lights. Agent Jones, leaning forward in his chair, a half-empty mug of coffee forgotten beside him, pointed at Sam's feed. "There," he murmured. "He just did it. The bunk. Did you see it, Miller?" Miller, whose gaze had been sweeping across the multiple screens, replayed the last 5 seconds of Sam's feed. He hadn't seen a grand gesture, no obvious signal. But then he recalled the tiny, almost imperceptible twitch of Sam's thumb, the way his hand lingered just a fraction too long. "The thread," Miller breathed, his eyes wide. "He caught a specific thread on the bunk." Jones nodded, a grim satisfaction settling on his face. "Precisely. And look." He gestured to the adjacent screen, displaying the mute. The man, previously inert, was now slowly, almost languidly, examining a crudely fashioned weapon. "Not exactly subtle anymore, is he?" Miller felt a chill despite the room's warmth. The meticulousness, the sheer audacity of Sam's operation was breathtaking. He had orchestrated this from within a maximum security prison, using signals so minute they were practically invisible to the untrained eye. Miller's initial gut feeling, dismissed by others as overthinking, was now being terrifyingly vindicated. On another screen, Whisper Johnson's low hum was clearly audible, even through the filtered audio. Boulder, next to him, was now openly shadowboxing, his movements surprisingly fluid for such a large man. The tension in the command center escalated with each passing second. The machine's silent hum was punctuated by the quick, anxious breaths of the federal agents and prison staff. "They're preparing," Agent Jones stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the rising panic Miller felt. "He's given the signal. The plan is in motion." Jones looked at Miller, his gaze intense. "Your instincts, Officer Miller, were spot on. You've given us the window we needed." Miller, however, wasn't thinking about validation. He was thinking about the implications, about the men in those cells, now primed for action, about the unsuspecting guards on their rounds. His heart hammered against his ribs. The prison's usual quiet had been replaced by a low, almost primal thrum beneath the surface, a growing rumble promising to erupt at any moment. The signal had been given. The stir had begun. The prison, usually a bastion of enforced order, felt like a powder keg, and Sam had just lit the fuse. The raid on cell block C. A sudden storm of shouts and the thunderous impact of tactical boots annihilated the fragile calm of cell block C. The air, thick with stale cleaning solution, and the ghost of contained desperation, tore open under the assault. From his perch near the control room monitor, Officer Miller flinched as Sam's cell feed sputtered, then sharpened. He saw it all. The microsecond before, Sam's eyes wide with dawning horror, his hand frozen midair. A silent, aborted command. Federal agents, a blur of dark uniforms and glinting gear, swept into the block with ruthless precision. Their arrival was less an entry, more an unstoppable wave, moving with a synchronized elegance born of countless drills and high-stakes stakes. Miller's gut clenched with a knot of adrenaline as the inmate's carefully constructed illusion of control dissolved. Sly Sam, who moments ago had been the unseen maestro of a dangerous symphony, was utterly blindsided. His customary composure, an iron mask of unreadable calm, visibly cracked. The subtle, almost imperceptible tremor Miller had come to recognize as a tell in Sam's hands became a blatant shake. Before Sam could even formulate a response, before his intricate web of communication could fully hum to life, two agents were at his door. One wielded a specialized device that made short work of the rudimentary lock. The other, a stern-faced woman with eyes like polished steel, held her firearm steady, covering the interior. "Samson, Sly Sam Blackwood," she growled, her voice cutting through the sudden din. "You are under arrest by federal authorities." Sam's mouth opened, then snapped shut. The words that might have ignited chaos, that might have unleashed carefully prepared violence, remained trapped. He made no sudden moves, offered no desperate lunge. The element of surprise had been absolute. His meticulously planned timing irrevocably shattered. He simply raised his hands, a flicker of reluctant admiration in his eyes as he met the agent's unwavering gaze. Across the cell block, the scene replicated itself with unnerving speed. The mute, caught sharpening his shiv against his bunk's underside, was tackled before the blade could even catch the fluorescent light. The shiv clattered, a mundane piece of metal shorn of its menace. "Whisper." Johnson, halfway through humming his signal, found himself slammed against the wall, his tuneless melody cut short by a grunt, and Boulder, flexing his formidable muscles, poised for the inevitable confrontation, was overwhelmed by a swarm of agents, his raw power rendered moot against their coordinated assault. Miller watched it all unfold, a peculiar blend of relief and awe washing over him. He'd known Sam for a dangerous master manipulator, but witnessing his entire operation dismantled with such ruthless efficiency was a revelation. His cameras, the tiny, almost invisible lenses he'd painstakingly installed, their feeds routed directly to a secure federal server, had been the linchpin. Every twitch, every glance, every subtle signal Sam had made had been recorded, analyzed, and weaponized. Within minutes, the main players in Sam's network were cuffed and being escorted from Cell Block C. The other inmates, on the precipice of uprising, were now a bewildered, murmuring mass. The kinetic energy that had been building, the palpable tension promising an explosion, dissipated into a confused, almost deflated silence. The escape, the riot, the grand plan, all moot before they'd truly begun. A tremor ran through Officer Miller, a delayed reaction to the immense stress. He doubted himself, questioned his instincts, but Agent Jones, and now this overwhelming display of federal power, had vindicated him. Sam was more than just a clever inmate. He was a kingpin. The sheer scale of this operation, the resources deployed, confirmed it. Miller had stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple prison break. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of antiseptic and fear still clinging to the air. But now it was mixed with something else, the fresh tang of victory. Quiet after the storm. A palpable quiet descended upon Blackwood Penitentiary, a quiet far more unnerving than the chaos it followed. The urgent shouts, the scuffle of boots, the barked commands of federal agents, all had faded into the stark silence of a prison returning to its enforced routine. The air, still thick with the lingering scent of disinfectant and a faint metallic tang, felt heavy, as if the very walls were exhaling after holding their breath. Inmates, usually boisterous and restless, moved with a subdued deference, their eyes darting, assessing, understanding that a line had been crossed, a fragile peace shattered, and a new, unspoken vigilance had been born. Officer Miller, his shoulders still aching from the tension of the previous hours, watched the slow, deliberate movements of the men in his block. The clatter of lunch trays, the monotonous drone of the intercom announcing yard time, the creak of cell doors. These sounds, once mundane, now held a sharper edge, a reminder of how easily they could have been drowned out by a different, more terrifying symphony. He ran a hand through his perpetually messy hair, feeling the grit of sleeplessness under his nails. The exhaustion was profound, a bone-deep weariness that settled in his muscles and dulled the sharp edges of his relief. He found himself replaying the covert footage in his mind, the ghostly images of Sly Sam, calm and calculating, manipulating his network from the confines of his solitary cell. The ingenuity had been breathtaking, terrifying in its precision. Who would have thought that the seemingly random scrawls on a toilet paper roll or the seemingly innocuous taps on a drainpipe could be part of such a complex cipher? Miller had prided himself on his ability to read people, to spot the tells, the subtle shifts in demeanor that betrayed intent. Yet Sam had worn his mask with such effortless grace, a benign smile hiding a mind that spun webs of such intricate design they bordered on artistry. The sheer audacity of it still made Miller's stomach clench. A full-scale uprising, not merely an escape, but a coordinated takeover, all orchestrated by a man locked away from the world. It was a testament to a criminal mind operating on a level few could comprehend, let alone counter. He remembered the moment he'd first seen the true extent of Sam's operation, the realization that this wasn't just about a few rogue inmates wanting out. This was a sophisticated enterprise, a meticulously planned operation with tendrils reaching far beyond the prison walls. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, a cold reminder of the constant, invisible war being waged in the shadows. Later that afternoon, during a shift change, Miller spoke briefly with Officer Davies, a grizzled veteran whose face usually wore a permanent scowl. Today, however, Davies' expression was less hostile, more reflective. "Never seen anything like it, Miller," Davies grunted, leaning against the sterile white wall of the guard station. "Thought I'd seen every trick in the book, but this was a whole new library." Miller nodded, appreciating the subtle shift in Davies's tone. "He was good, Davies. Too good." "That's the kicker, isn't it? Makes you wonder what else we're missing. What else is brewing under our noses while we're checking for shanks and contraband phones?" Davies paused, then added, "You did good, Miller. Real good. Your gut feeling. It saved a lot of lives." The unexpected praise from Davies was a small comfort, a quiet validation that warmed a corner of Miller's weary heart. He had doubted himself so many times, questioned his own instincts, felt the weight of skepticism from his superiors. But his persistence, his almost obsessive attention to the minute details, had paid off. It had exposed a truth far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The federal agents, after their initial sweep, had left a noticeable imprint. New security protocols were being discussed, tighter restrictions on inmate communication, increased surveillance in unexpected corners. The sense of invulnerability that had perhaps subtly permeated the prison staff, a quiet confidence born of years of routine, had been shattered. Now, a healthy paranoia had taken root, a constant undercurrent of suspicion that hummed beneath the surface of every interaction. Miller walked the main corridor, his footsteps echoing in the almost deserted hall. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting long, stark shadows. He observed the freshly painted walls, the gleaming floors, the seemingly impenetrable bars. Outwardly, Blackwood Penitentiary was the same fortress it had always been, but the events of the past few days had revealed a profound vulnerability, a chink in the armor that had been exploited with terrifying precision. He stopped outside Sam's now empty cell. The door was still open, a cold, dark rectangle in the brightly lit corridor. Inside, it was barren, stripped bare, scrubbed clean. No trace remained of the man who had woven such a tangled web from within its confines. Yet Miller could almost feel Sam's presence, a lingering echo of his calculating mind, a phantom whisper of his audacious ambition. The experience had taught Miller a harsh, undeniable truth. Vigilance was not merely a duty. It was a state of being. It was the constant questioning, the refusal to accept things at face value, the unwavering belief that even in the most secure environments, danger lurked in the unseen, the unheard, the meticulously hidden. The quiet after the storm was not a return to peace, but a period of heightened awareness, a reminder that the war against criminal ingenuity was ceaseless, and its battlegrounds could be found in the most unexpected of places. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not the end. It was merely a pause, a breath taken before the next battle began, and he would be ready.